Morning. I'm McKay, and today we're going to be taking a look at George Orwell's Coming Up for Air. First published in 1939, just before the outbreak of World War II, Coming Up for Air is the only novel that George Orwell wrote that is told in the first person, which I think is quite interesting. Although he did write quite a few other pieces which were written in the first person, down and out in London and Paris, for instance. I'm pretty sure that was told in the first person. It's been a while since I read it. And The Road to Wigan Pier, but at the same time they're not really novels, they're more, of his kind of journalistic kind of takes on things, so they're actually more kind of social commentaries than novels. It was before he wrote his most the works that made him famous, Animal Farm and 1984. The former actually plays quite a bit of a parallel to it, which I'll get onto a bit later. But so what's the story? I'll start with this. He actually wrote it. Eric Blair, or Eric Arthur Blair, if you don't know, was George Orwell's real name. And during the summer of, I think, 38 or 39, I'm assuming 38, considering it came out in 39, he was actually severely ill with tuberculosis, which eventually killed him. But during this time, it was advised for him to go to a warm climate because he was in really bad health. And he ended up going to Marrakesh and spent the summer there, ill, but he managed to write this book. And then when he returned to England, I think within hours he put it onto a publisher's desk. And yeah, that's kind of how the book was come about. And it's interesting to note that because it's called Coming Up for Air, and if you've got consumption, then obviously you can see clear parallels between that, and how the title of the book kind of speaks to Arthur Blair, or Eric Arthur Blair's literal kind of longing, but the actual expression of coming up for air in this piece particularly is more about nostalgia, and that's kind of what the book is talking about throughout. Well, that's one of the themes and probably the main theme of it. So the story is told from the perspective of George Fatty Bowling, who is a middle-aged 45-year-old, I think, insurance salesman. He's got 2 kids, rotten little kids he doesn't like, and he's got a wife that he doesn't love anymore called Hilda, who he describes as someone who's just worrying about everything that is mundane in the world. And it begins with him getting a pair of false teeth. So I suppose it's a good trigger, I think, because it's like, for him, he's realising his age, and the fact that he knows he's basically literally decaying, the fact that he's just got this new set of teeth, and that kind of prompts the whole novel, because it's not really the plot is very basic. It's not a plot-based thing. It's more of a kind of character piece. And it also happens to be that he's just won 17 quid from a horse race bet, and he's pondering what to do with it. He's kept it from his wife. He declares that he's sick of doing the right thing, basically, and he wants to kind of just do something for him. And obviously him gambling in the first place is not something he wants to share with Hilda. And he's kind of pondering what to do. So this is where you kind of get into his character, and you understand his position in life, where he's at. And the fact that he feels very stuck in his mundane existence. There's often, some of the prose in it is beautiful. It's really it's very funny, I'd say. It's got this bleak, kind of pessimistic outlook to it, which I loved. But it's also got a kind of ironic humour, which really balances the kind of pessimism within it, because it's all fully justified. I'd say it's like a satire, but it's also like a realistic satire, because especially if you're English or you have memories of a certain type of England, this is definitely one of those novels that really makes you remember certain things of your own past, because whilst he's talking about his own childhood and where he was brought up, another world that has seemingly disappeared, you're also reminded of your own kind of youth, and you kind of think back. It reminded me, I was thinking about the house I grew up in whilst reading it at times, and how I haven't seen it, but I already know that that's been converted into a kind of student flat house now. So I imagine it looks completely different to how I grew up, and most of my years were spent living in an attic. I'm sure that's probably gone now. I don't know for sure, but it's one of those things, like even the road you grew up on and things like that, you can just kind of imagine how different it probably looks. There might still be one or two things that are still there, but I bet it doesn't look the same. That's basically the beginning. You kind of learn about this guy's life. There's a little bit of a kind of social commentary in it from Orwell, where he's talking about building societies, and basically the road that George Bowling lives on, they're all under this illusion that they own these houses, but really they're owned by the building societies that grant them the kind of permission to live there and give them this false illusion of owning it, when really they don't. They just pay outrageous mortgages for a building that they don't even own at the end of it anyway. So Orwell also had kind of socialist leanings, and he was kind of making a bit of a commentary on that. In a very funny way. I found it very amusing, because Bowling's bemoaning the whole thing and talking about them rising up a statue that's like half woman, half man, to parallel the kind of existence of their lives, really, and how, you give them a smack and they just kiss your hand, so because really they know that they're taking you for a ride the whole time. So after the first book, or section if you will, George goes into his past because he's reminded of it going to I can't remember specifically what it is, but he gets a trigger, and that kind of makes him dive into his past. So the book's kind of sectioned into about 4 parts. The beginning is like the introduction to George Fatty Bowling, and he talks about being fat, which I thought was hilarious at times, because he acts like, and I think this is probably true, at least for this era, because there's people who just don't know him will come up and go, "Oi, fatso, you got the time, mate?" and stuff like that. So it's just like really, and he just gives these kind of commentary of like how if you're fat, there's a kind of social expectancy to be constantly jovial and happy with your lot and have a smile and some kind of dumb grin on your face, and be perfectly fine with people insulting you who you don't even know on a kind of day-to-day basis. And I found his rants about that hilarious, and I really warmed to him because of those. And it really just reminds you of people that you knew when you were growing up as well. So it kind of fittingly turns itself on its head and then dives into George's past. I did read that Orwell grew up in a place that was similar. I think it might have been near the Thames, but I'm not positive on that. And he basically talks about a world that is so far removed from the one that he's in now, even during the 30s, that it's almost like it's so nostalgic to him. But what I liked as well is that he realises that his memories of the place that he grew up are probably false. So there is an element of self-awareness to George Bowling that I quite liked, and also an awareness of him not necessarily remembering it the way it actually was, which of course would naturally capture what it's like to be a child. And whilst you're developing, you kind of conjure up a lot of memories, but the ones that stick to you for some reason always kind of, they never go away, false or true. So I found that quite poetic, actually. My only complaint about that section, which I'd call section 2, is it goes on a bit. If you're a fishing fan, you'll love it. Might sound weird to say, but he talks about fishing all the time. He's got these memories of like catching fish that he never caught, and he knew he never caught, but that was always the dream, and that memory actually serves as his dreams in a way, because of the things we think of becoming when we're young often don't come into fruition at all. And even if they do, they won't in the way that you imagine them, but they still hold something to your heart. And I found that quite beautiful in a way. And yeah, it's nostalgic and melancholic, but it's truthful as well, I'd say. I found Bowling to be a very well-rounded character. But in that particular section, he does ramble on about fishing a lot. I was getting a bit impatient with it towards the end of it. Then he ends up going to this meeting called the Left Book Club. And they're basically, this is where you get this kind of foreshadowing of war, which plays a role throughout, because there's constant like air raid bombers kind of scouting the areas and stuff like that, and going over, flying over these places. So you know there's something going on, but you don't really know when or how or why it's even going to happen. But during this Left Book Club, there's a kind of Marxist type there rambling on nonsensically to George's perspective, and another who I think anti-fascist or something like that. So they're constant debates and things that, although George has an interest and a kind of fear of it happening, he also realises that his own political views mean jack shit to anyone, and it doesn't matter, because what's going to happen is going to happen, and he's powerless, and we're all powerless to stop that. So these young people banging on about socialist rights or communism and blah blah blah, it really means very little to a 45-year-old fat man in sales. What's his life going to be in 5 years' time? The thing he mainly worries about is what the war is going to do to England again. There is some commentary about commercialism and rampant capitalism that has basically swiped the whole identity of England in particular, which I thought was a good, interesting commentary. And again, it does foreshadow Orwell's own writing of 1984 very well, and you can see the ideas he's formulating within this novel for the novel he's going to write later on, which I found fascinating and definitely worth looking into if you're a writer as well, because you can kind of see it in your own writing sometimes, of the ideas that you're conjuring up that aren't quite ready or prepared to actually write, but they're the cogs are already in motion, and it's really fascinating to see that. But after this left-hand meeting, or Left Book Club meeting, he finally decides to go and visit his childhood home, and it's not really a spoiler because it's obvious that that's what he's going to end up doing. Here he kind of shows a bit of his own deluded mindset, or at least I suppose a kind of hope, but it is a delusion, because he kind of thinks that he's going to go back to his place, he's going to find this pond that he discovered whilst he was a kid that no one knew about, and he's going to finally catch the carp that he saw in it, and stuff like that. And he kind of has this idea that he's going to go back there and recapture his youth, but he's very disappointed even before he enters there, because he realises how different it all looks straight away. Everything's a sea of fucking bricks, which he says, and he basically has his kind of whole illusion of it shattered straight away, which is also an ironic kind of thing, because even though he knows his memories are bullshit and the things he remembers of England in particular, he still has this kind of naivety to him that wants to recapture it, but the realization is that you can't, it's all gone, and the whole coming up for air is actually just a kind of longing that none of us can really capture or recapture or even hope to recapture, because what you remember from the past is literally in the past. So nothing it's got a kind of anticlimactic ending really, which didn't belittle it at all. It's just there wasn't really much place for it to go really, and the kind of monotony of his day-to-day existence and the predictability of it is kind of heightened. It's definitely Orwell's funniest novel. The only things I've got to complain about it would be that the second section went on a bit too long. But apart from that, I really enjoyed it. It's a cosy read, really. Especially if you're English, you'll get a lot out of it, because you'll be reminded at least of things in the past that you might not have experienced yourself, but you have memories of them anyway, because that's the kind of things that you grow up around, and this kind of nostalgia. And I think it's interesting to read something like this nowadays because of our nostalgia obsession within the media and within TV shows. I'm looking at you, Stranger Things 3. But this whole and the fact that we're just remaking fucking the same films over and over again, it definitely points to a kind of similarity, at least, that we have this longing to return to a certain time, and the memory of it might be bullshit, but at least it was a time that seemed to make more sense, with everything from AI rising up to the economic kind of situation of the planet, as well as the climate change that is clearly going on. It's like we don't really have any idea what the future's got around the corner, and most of it just seems to point to disaster. And I think it's mainly because we realise we have no control of it now. Capitalism has got to a point where it's literally a machine that runs whether you like it or fucking not. So, and the fact that it's been working for such a long time, and that's what Orwell also pointed out throughout the piece, is like it's just this rising thing that you can't stop, like a massive kind of tidal wave coming up, and it's like no, everyone's part of it, but at the same time it almost feels like no one's part of it, because you just don't know what's going on, so it's like you can't predict it. And yeah, how everything changes. There was a few reviews I noticed that were moaning about the depiction of women throughout the novel, and I'd like to point out that I thought they was all bollocks, because they basically said that it had a two-dimensional view of women, but the story's told in first person. So essentially, every other character apart from the fucking narrator is obviously still going to be somewhat two-dimensional, because you're only getting their perspective of the people around them. You could argue, as a counter, that should the sub-characters have more dialogue or more of a role within the novel, that they would gain a kind of more third-dimensional view. But at the same point, you're only ever getting the perspective still from the fucking narrator. So if he says, or she says, if it was a woman, that a certain person said something in a certain tone, you're only hearing it through their perspective still. So whether or not you can rely on that, who knows? Sure, dialogue can reveal things about a character that, you know, you might not necessarily have known otherwise. But at the same time, I didn't find the depictions of women two-dimensional. I've actually just found them honest, really. He describes his wife as someone who just moans about stuff, I think I mentioned this already, from like there being no salt on the table rather than the fucking impending war that is clearly happening. And it's just, but I've known, especially women who have been like that, especially middle-aged women, and I think everyone's met this kind of type of person who just worries about everything, but it also turns into a game, which I thought Orwell described really well, because it actually ends up becoming more of an identity thing than anything else, and therefore there's a kind of whole thing about looking for the latest deals and coupons in fucking certain magazines and stuff like that, and it becomes this constant worry. So it's like you can see his reason for keeping this winning of money out of Hilda's knowledge, because she would know about him gambling for one, but also it's like she'd just take it and just spend it so boringly that he doesn't really want that to happen. So it's like I can completely agree with his kind of perspective on that account. You could argue maybe that he's a bit harsh looks-wise, but at the same time he knows that he's no looker anymore. He even says like no woman would even look at him twice unless he paid them to. So it's like there is an acknowledgement of his own kind of deterioration, and you know, everyone loses their looks after a while. I don't think it's just because he describes the women around him or certain women to have lost their kind of, you know, finesse, because he outright admits that everyone loses it, really, and especially himself, and he's like he doesn't even want to look at himself in the mirror. A lot of the humour comes from the kind of contradictions and the ironies of his comments. He's just a fucking lovable schmuck, really. I thought he was great. At the time as well, I might as well mention this, I suppose, 17 quid might not sound like much, but during the 30s that equates to about 250 in nowadays times. So it's a sum of money that you could do something for. I don't know whether you could spend a week somewhere on that, but so as if you're on your own and you've already got the hotel paid or whatever, you could probably do something. But from what I've experienced with hotels, you couldn't fucking you couldn't pay a hotel for a week, especially near somewhere like this place, which is kind of on the outskirts of London or something like that. So, yeah, that's it, really. If you're familiar with Orwell, obviously I could have done Animal Farm on 1984, and I might do in the future, but I thought this one was a good place to start. It's one of the funniest novels he wrote, probably the funniest, and it's just although it is pessimistic and bleak and somewhat without hope, I actually found the tone of it to be mildly positive in ways. It's just kind of accepting of reality, and although that probably is a pessimistic thing, it was refreshing to hear someone actually just speak, you know, like a fucking normal human being, really, and that's what I kind of really appreciated of the novel. And the fact that it is within its realism, so it's got, you know, historical elements to it, realism about growing up, and the disillusionment about life in general, which I thought was really cool. And Orwell's just such a fucking good writer that it's worth investing your time in his lesser known works anyway. And as a kind of preparation towards 1984, it definitely works really well, because 1984 is fucked up, and it's really... And this is just a nice kind of bit of realism with a kind of satirical tone that will kind of warm you into it, I think. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you very much for watching. That's it. I'll see you next week. I haven't got much else to say. Buy my books, please. And that'll be it. Thank you very much. I'm DC McKay. See you next week.